morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in-house to make that final courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off. It is always appreciated. We will post the program on our Heritage homepage for your future reference. And, of course, our Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Kumi Yokoi, Senior Visiting Fellow in our Asian Studies Center. Dr. Yokoi is one of Japan's leading authorities on the United States. As a guest commentator, she has analyzed Japanese politics on CNN and BBC. Over the past decade, she has worked as a political consultant for private businesses. Before that, she was a fellow at the Matsushita Institute of Government and Management and a visiting fellow at Princeton University. She holds a PhD in policy science from Chiba University of Commerce, northeast of Tokyo, where she also received master's degrees in economics and commerce. She has earned her undergraduate degree in business. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Dr. Yokoi.
Thank you for coming to the Heritage Foundation today. Today, we will discuss the future of space policy in regards to the U.S.-Japan alliance, as well as regarding China. It sounds like Star Wars and Star Trek. Yes, why we will discuss it? Because the Heritage Foundation helped to make Star Wars by President Reagan. As you know, his strategic defense initiative later became known as the Star Wars. And the U.S.-Japan alliance is strong, even more so after the U.S. helped Japan after its Great East Japan earthquake 3 years ago today. Japan appreciates the help given by the U.S. and continue to recognize how important the alliance continue to be. The U.S.-Japan collaboration on space policy and national security is still very new. The U.S. and Japan announced that collaboration on space and cyber issues only a couple of years ago. While cybersecurity has already taken off as a big issue, space, on the other hand, has not been discussed as much as it should. Yet, space is becoming ever more important, especially in light of the problems of China's anti-access area denial strategy and the Japanese, American, and allied concerns about maritime domain awareness. If the U.S. and Japan are to cooperate in preserving their mutual security, then they must be able to cooperate on space-related issues, including the sharing of information and fielding compatible and complementary systems. Today, we have several distinguished speakers with us to discuss these issues. First, we have Representative Katsuyuki Kawai, 5-time elected member of Japan House of Representatives and former chairman of the Diet Committee of International Affairs. Since taking office, he has focused on space policy. As far as I know, he is the only one Japanese representative to focus on this area entirely. Second, we have Dean Chen, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He is our in-house expert on Chinese space policy. Dean will be speaking about Chinese view of space, which are major factor influencing U.S.-Japan space cooperation. And third, we have Dr. John Sheridan. He is a research fellow for George C. Marshall Institute and former professor at the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies at the U.S. Air Force's Air War College. He is long-time expert on space and cybersecurity issues and has also looked extensively at deterrence issues. He will be discussing the role of space in American military thinking and how that is likely to affect American relations with key Asian players, including Japan. First, we will start with a 20-minute presentation from Representative Kawai. Then we will hear from Dean and Dr. Sheridan for about 10 to 15 minutes each. After, we will go into Q&A. Okay, Representative Kawai.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Yokoe. It is my great honor to have an opportunity to speak to you here today in such a very distinguished foundation. Before I move on to the main theme of my speech, I'm delighted to report that on Friday, February 28th, the GPM Core Observatory, which was jointly developed by the United States and Japan, was successfully launched by a 82A rocket from Japan's Tanegashima Space Center. I was able to watch the launch at the center together with U.S. Ambassador Caroline Kennedy. Based on our strong alliance, Japan and the United States have built close ties in a wide range of fields. Today, I would like to share my ideas with you regarding the new era of the Japan-US cooperation on space. First, I would like everyone in this room to know that space development and utilization in Japan were required to be passive, restricted to activities that were for purely scientific purposes up to just a few years ago, specifically up to the enactment in 2008 of the Basic Space Law and the 2012 revision to the law concerning Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA. Part of Japan's history is that in 1969, the Diet unanimously passed the resolution on the basics of space development and utilization, through which we were required to strictly limit our development and utilization of space to exclusively peaceful, non-military purposes. However, in 1998, North Korea launched a missile over Japanese territory. Following that, China rapidly expanded its military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. This meant that Japan's security environment had very dramatically destabilized, and many of our citizens felt increasingly concerned about our nation's ability to defend itself. In response to this rising concern among the Japanese people, the Liberal Democratic Party, as the party in power, came to have a growing sense that Japan should use space in order to protect its peace and independence, and embarked on efforts to reorient the Japanese development and utilization of space towards international standards, which is peaceful as non-aggressive. From a political point of view, I suggested that it was more practical to enact a new law through a bill submitted by Diet members in order to overcome the resolution in 1969 and wound up being charged with the stimulating task of producing a draft for the new law. I created 5 principles for the anticipated space development and utilization of Japan as the backbone of the new space basic law, namely diplomacy, security, the thirdly, industrialization, national inspiration and dreams for the future, and the great contribution to evolution of humankind. This was in 2006. The bill for the basic space law subsequently became law in May 2008 by majority votes in both houses after consultations between government and opposition parties. At one time, it was said that whoever rules the land rules the world. Later, it was said that whoever rules the ocean rules the world. Then, whoever rules the sky, now whoever rules space and cyberspace rules the world. Space has become the yardstick to measure national capabilities in diplomacy and security. Japan has developed and launched on its own the H-2B launch vehicle, the large-scale launch vehicle, which it transfers cargoes to the International Space Station, ISS, and the Epsilon launch vehicle, the solid propellant rocket into which an artificial intelligence that conducts autonomous inspection before the launch is incorporated. Japan has also developed and manufactured on its own satellites and spacecraft to be loaded on these rockets. For example, spacecrafts and satellites with missions such as making a round trip to an asteroid and bringing back precious particles. Also, Japan is operating information gathering satellites that gather image information regarding national security and disasters. And also, Japan has approximately 20 control centers to control and operate these satellites from the ground on its own. Moreover, Japan is the only Asian nation that is taking part in the ISS program. Just 2 days ago, on March the 9th, astronaut Wakata Koichi became the first Asian commander of the ISS in due recognition not only of his personal capabilities, character, and achievements, but also of Japan's great contributions to the ISS program. Japan has yet to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, but I believe that Japan has already been a permanent council member for space. I believe that Japan should apply the development and utilization of space in a more proactive manner as a means to expand and deepen the Japan-US alliance. Then, space cooperation between Japan and the US should aim at a comprehensive framework that not only covers civilian activities, but also security issues. Among the cooperation between Japan and the US in the area of security utilizing space, the two areas that I believe are of importance are space situational awareness, SSA, and maritime domain awareness, MDA. SSA is the surveillance of the situation in space, that is the station of space debris, important satellites from the ground level. In this regard, the Japan-US SSA cooperation agreement was concluded last May. That agreement makes it possible for the US Strategic Command to expeditiously provide detailed SSA information to JAXA, the Japan Meteorological Agency, and other Japanese organizations operating satellites. Final adjustments are also being made to enable JAXA on a provisional basis to provide the U.S. Strategic Command with information on SSA. And at last, serious discussions have begun in Japan on the use of satellites for MDA. Actually, just last month, we invited Dr. John Sheldon, to the first study session of the Space Diplomacy Forum, which was held in the Diet Building. There, the National Security Council, which has been newly established in the Cabinet Secretariat, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Education, Science and Technology, JAXA, and the aerospace industry had a lively discussion on the necessity of introducing MDA to Japan's surroundings. It is believed that 20 to 40 satellites would be necessary in order to conduct detailed surveillance of the ocean with no blind spots by satellite alone. This means that coordination with drones and other aircraft, high-altitude air balloons, and foreign satellites will be a must for an effective MDA framework. The ALOS-2 satellite, which Japan will be launching this year, will have a range of 16 miles, while the next generation ALOS-3 will have a range of 31 miles. They will have performance capabilities surpassing 13-mile range of the 1-meter high-resolution satellites commonly used by other countries. They will be effective as satellites for MDA. The importance of SSA and MDA was confirmed in last October's joint statement of the Japan-US 2+2. SSA and MDA are receiving attention as new domains of space cooperation between Japan and the United States. At the International Space Exploration Forum, ISAF, held in January this year, which attracted participation from over 30 countries worldwide, Japan announced it would host the second forum in Japan in 2016 or 2017. Japan will serve as the secretariat until the next forum and has undertaken a significant duty to lead the second forum to be an event that generates outcomes meaningful to the progress of humankind. Additionally, I believe Japan should proactively participate in extending operation of the ISS until 2024, as proposed by the US at ISAF, because the ISS is not a mere scientific laboratory, but it is the symbol of the Japan-US alliance in space. In the event that manned exploration missions to Mars become a reality in the 2030s, I believe Japan and the US should play a central role for leading international space exploration program, so that the US Stars and Stripes flag and Japan's Hinomaru flag fly side by side on the ground on Mars. Currently, more than 50 countries possess satellites, and outer space is becoming increasingly congested, and space debris continues to grow. Amid that, the ASAT experiment conducted by China in 2007, which sent a large quantity of space debris scattering, is still in recent memory. Rising quantities of space debris and satellite destruction experiments pose a threat to the ISS and other countries' satellites. In order to prevent such harmful space activities, it is becoming increasingly important to strengthen the rule of law in space and to create a framework. Accordingly, Japan has joined the debate on formulating the International Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities, proposed by the European Union in 2008, and is actively contributing to this effort. As the oldest democracy in Asia, Japan will also contribute to the creation of rules for space in the future. Conceivably, that will involve efforts such as encouraging countries using satellites in the Asia-Pacific region to participate in the debate and assume the role of the central point of contact once the code of conduct is formulated. Well, the 86 Academy Awards were recently held. Gravity by director Alfonso Cuarón won 7 awards, including Best Director. I saw the movie with my wife in my hometown of Hiroshima and enjoyed the beauty and realism of that movie, which made us feel as if we were in outer space. However, the film's end, and those of you who have not yet seen it, you might want to cover your ears here for a bit, was a great shock to me. The ISS is destroyed by space debris, and an astronaut, played by Sandra Bullock, who was performing a spacewalk at that time, is flung into outer space. Ultimately, however, she boards a Chinese-made spaceship moored to the Chinese space station, Tiangong, a duplicate of a Russian rocket, and returns safely to Earth. Now you can uncover your ears here. When Hollywood makes Gravity 2, I will request that the scenario involves an astronaut returning safely and alive to Earth thanks to Japanese space technology. I thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Representative Kawai, for some very interesting and informative remarks. Your conclusion, citing gravity, is a reminder of the power that space continues to have in capturing the imagination. Kumi opened with reference to Star Trek and Star Wars, and all of this is a reminder of how much space permeates popular thinking and culture. And in this regard, I would say that China, too, has picked up on this. And so China's space program is not necessarily motivated by Star Trek, Star Wars, or gravity, but absolutely it touches upon a variety of aspects of what the Chinese term comprehensive national power. The Chinese emphasize that space is something that basically can facilitate, can encourage every aspect of Chinese calculations of its own national capabilities, and it factors them into calculations of others' national capabilities. The term comprehensive national power, interestingly, was first, I believe, introduced by the Japanese in the 1980s. But the Chinese and Japanese both use it in the same way, which is to say, how can we think about a nation's overall strength? It is not enough to think primarily, certainly not solely, about military power. We saw what happened in the Soviet Union, and Xi Jinping in recent speeches has reminded the Chinese people that of the Soviet collapse. So military power by itself is not enough. But economic power by itself is also not enough. Economies rise, economies fall, and at the end of the day, economic capability only buys you so much. So in addition to both of these important factors, there is the level of one's national political development, how unified is the country. There is the amount of diplomatic respect accorded it by other states. There is the amount of cultural security. How proud are people to be Chinese, Japanese, American? And also, how much technological prowess is there within that country, the level of S&T development. And in this regard, the Chinese look at their overall space capabilities as contributing to each aspect. It contributes to Chinese political unity because China's space capabilities are often touted as reflecting national achievements, the achievements brought to you courtesy of the Chinese Communist Party, because, of course, the space program is indeed a product of high high-level decisions and consistent support by the senior leadership of the CCP. It brings about diplomatic respect. The Chinese, through their space program, created the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, which ties together a number of countries to China in the interests of space cooperation. Interestingly, APSCO leaves out the Indians and the Japanese, the other major space powers in Asia. It contributes to education. The Chinese want to make sure that young people want to go into engineering, want to go into, in particular, aerospace engineering. And having a space program with such achievements as the recent lunar landings of the Jade Rabbit and also manned space is a way of inspiring people to choose to become aerospace engineers. This is of particular import as, globally speaking, aerospace workforces age. We are seeing this in particular in Russia, but also even here in the United States. We also see space, in the Chinese view, as contributing to the broad improvement of China's economy. By creating a space program, you are facilitating the development of advanced materials, of energy and power generation, better solar panels. Space, as the Chinese describe it, is very dense in high technology, so it also contributes to telecommunications, to computer-aided design and manufacturing. It is a means of hopefully improving quality control, and it is no accident that the head of COMAC, the Commercial Aircraft Corporation, China's effort to develop a new airliner, comes out of the Chinese Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, hopefully, in their view, bring with them aspects of advanced design, but also high quality control and industrial integration. Finally, but certainly not least important, there is the military aspect. Kumi and Representative Kawai have both touched on the issues of space situational awareness and maritime domain awareness. And both of these are elemental to Chinese thinking about future security, because both of them are parts of what the Chinese term information dominance. Information dominance, the ability to apply information in and of itself as a weapon, basically is integral to the ability to fight what the Chinese term local wars under informationized conditions. This is how the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, looking at the last 20 years of warfare, beginning with Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, through operations in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and the Second War in Iraq, basically has relied increasingly upon information technology to exploit the collection, transmission, exploitation, and application of information. And that information flow allows for the ability to create air dominance. It is, we expect, they expect, to be part of how you achieve maritime dominance. It is integral to how the Chinese think about anti-access area denial, keeping allied, in particular American air power, as far away as possible from China's new economic center of gravity, which is on its coast. But to that end, space plays an essential role. Because it is the key strategic high ground, and this is how the Chinese themselves describe outer space, the ability to access space, the ability to maintain data links from space-based sensors to terrestrial users is a key means of achieving information dominance. And so space and the associated electromagnetic spectrum of those data links is expected by PLA analysts to be a key part of future warfare. The struggle for information dominance will determine basically who will win and who will lose. For the United States, we have generally faced opponents who have not been able to challenge the U.S. in space, and to a large extent even electromagnetically. China is very different from Iraq. China is very different from Afghanistan, very different, and also from Serbia and the former Yugoslavia, in the sense that this is a country that has its own space capabilities, its own space networks. This is not a country that you can deny access to space or space-based sensors because, one, China is not reliant upon too, China increasingly will have very large amounts of financial wherewithal to buy access and to challenge the American ability to deny that access. Let me stop there to say that this is the space will be an area of competition between the U.S. and China, and between Japan and China, and between China and the rest of the world. And the shape of that will not necessarily be military or conflictual, but it will be competitive.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to Dean and the Heritage Foundation for inviting me to speak today. I've been asked to speak about the role of space in the US military and how the US military think about this, and then my remarks will move to the geopolitical context in East Asia and some of the opportunities and challenges that the US faces in cooperating with allies such as Japan in the region on space issues, especially on the national security side of things. First of all, I need to say that there is a reality of the US reliance on space and a perception of the US reliance on space within the US military. And I say this as someone who for 6 years worked for the US Air Force at their Air University in Alabama. And in case any of you are wondering, yes, this is a northern Alabama accent. I'm Alabamian through and through. But the one thing I did learn, though, is that there is a reality and a perception, even within the US military. The reality is that space is not integrated in all US military operations. It's more than that. It's woven into US military operations. And by that I mean not just combat operations that we see every day in Afghanistan and more recently in Iraq and so on, but in everyday things like, for example, logistics, in everyday communications, in everyday operations that require any form of synchronization of timing and location using GPS, for example, intelligence gathering and assessments, so satellite imagery, all these kind of things are all reliant, more than reliant on space. Space is woven into them. The perception is that, well, space plays a role marginally on these kind of things. I don't need space, sir. As long as I have my M16 and my GPS receiver, I'm okay. In other words, we use space every day, yet often there is not the realization that we actually do use space every day. As long as I have this GPS receiver, sir, I'm okay. I don't need space. It's an urban legend, but I've seen it enough times and heard it enough times to realize that there is the reality of space integration and reliance in the US military and the perception. I remember one US Army colonel who had seen perhaps one too many deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan bang his fist on the table, and I'm paraphrasing here because the language was not fit for family viewing, but had basically said, I don't need any damn satellites. As long as I've got satellite communications, I'm fine. And this is a problem. It's not a problem, I say, but it's a challenge that persists throughout the US military, despite 20 years at least of effort at space integration throughout the joint force. That's not to say that those attitudes are prevalent in the US military. They're not. But I would say even among those in the US military who are outside of the national security space community, that is, who understand that we are reliant upon space and that space is critical to everything that we do, there's probably little idea as to what extent we are reliant upon space. And I say this because in the past year I've heard a lot more comments and murmurings from a lot of people, including here in Washington, D.C., who say space is too vulnerable, is too expensive to protect, therefore we need to get rid of our reliance upon space systems and replace it with something else. Sounds very nice. And indeed, the US military is training on some critical operations on how to operate in a space-degraded environment. If you talk to US Navy submariners, for example, who do rely on space for a number of those things, they're not necessarily cutting off space from their operations, but they are training themselves on how to operate without having to rely on space. The same is true also of some strategic missions in the US Air Force. That doesn't mean they won't be using space, but it does mean they'll be able to perhaps perform mission assurance in a space-degraded environment, and hopefully that will not include performing such missions in East Asia, but they are prepared for such things anyway. The point I'm trying to make here, of course, is that we can't get rid of satellites. We can't get rid of our reliance on satellites. We are stuck with them, and there are no cheap alternatives on the horizon. So what alternatives do we have? And unfortunately, we are going to have to look at space protection, which is expensive. We are going to have to look at space control, a controversial term that we haven't heard for, I reckon, since the early 2000s in the previous Bush administration. But now we're hearing actually Obama administration officials say those two words together, space control. They're also talking about things like counter space, which is a euphemism for space control. In other words, countering an adversary's attempts to deny us our use of space, and at the same time assuring that we can use space when we need to. So the role of space in US military thinking is better than it was 20 years ago, for example, but it's still conflicted in some corners. And there are those people who are living in a realm of unreality, if you will, by thinking that somehow we can gain the same benefits that space systems have provided us, and still do, without satellites. And unfortunately, that is not the case. There is also a disconnect between the role of space in US military thinking and the geopolitical context. There is a notion that somehow space applies everywhere around the world in the same way and in the same manner. And I would argue that's not necessarily the case. When you look at, for example, the locus of US military operations over the past 14 years, which has been in Central Asia and the Middle East, we have obviously done operations there in what I would call a space-free zone, in the sense that we are the only operators there that matter. And as Dean has already pointed out, the next few decades point to a scenario where we will not be enjoying de facto space superiority, and we will have to fight for that space superiority against adversaries who are far more intellectually and capability equipped, if you will, in space matters, and are prepared to fight for their, if you will, their corner of space, and also deny us the advantages of using it as well. And that geopolitical context, of course, is emerging in East Asia, and it's part of a wider geopolitical shift that we've been witnessing over the past 20 years. That, if you will, is an update of the Mackinder-Spikeman notion of the heartland, the geopolitical heartland shifting eastward across the Eurasian landmass towards East Asia. And of course, East Asia is now the place where we have the locus of world global economic activity. We're seeing an uptick in territorial disputes in the region between China and Japan, for example, between China and countries in the South China Sea, such as the Philippines and Vietnam, and so on. And we're also seeing increases in military spending and increases in military power in the region as well, to include space systems, and not just with China and Japan. We're seeing, for example, South Korea engage in a very ambitious space program. Same with Vietnam, same with Thailand, the same with Malaysia, Indonesia, and also emerging in the region, we're seeing Australia, Singapore, and Mongolia. Yes, Mongolia. Mongolia has space ambitions, and when you look at their unique, particular geopolitical context, one can understand why, trapped there between China and Russia. So we're seeing a lot of activity in this area, and the United States is also one of those actors in the region. The United States is an Asia-Pacific space power. When you look at the US presence in the region, not just militarily, but also just economically, but also when you look at the fact, for example, that the US is the major provider of global public goods from space, such as the Global Positioning System, which is still the major satellite navigation system used in the region, even by China, who have their own, or are developing their own, satellite navigation system, Beidou. So we're seeing a number of activities in the region, including that of the US. There is, of course, geopolitical risk, and the United States at the moment is particularly susceptible to this geopolitical risk. Not necessarily from East Asia. I would argue, for example, that recent events in Ukraine and the Crimea expose these geopolitical risks. From a civil space perspective, the United States relies on Russia for the launch of its astronauts to the International Space Station, but also their recovery from the International Space Station back down to Earth. And those capabilities could be at risk if relations between Russia and the United States deteriorate even further. You might argue that manned spaceflight isn't that important. I would argue, actually, for a superpower like the United States, it's immensely important. It's part of that prestige and that symbolism of what makes the United States a great country, a great power, if not the greatest power in the world, including space. But it is in East Asia that we need to look for the next few decades. And I would argue that there is, if you will, both potential for cooperation in the region, but also some work to be done in shoring up our capabilities there as well. First of all, we should look at US space policy. Is it fit for purpose? And the last time we had a space policy issued was in 2010, the US National Space Policy by the Obama administration. And one of the remarkable things about US space policy is that when you look at the fundamentals of that policy, it has endured since the first policy promulgated by President Eisenhower in the late 1950s. The particulars may change in terms of advances in technology, changes in the geopolitical context, and so on and so forth, but the fundamentals, peaceful uses of outer space, freedom of access to space, freedom of navigation in space, those principles of the US space policy have not changed in the past 60 years and are unlikely to change in the future. The policy covers a great deal of contingencies and activities within US space activities as a whole. And by that I mean not just civil space activities, but also commercial and national security. And what we're seeing in the last few months is a shift in emphasis from an emphasis on international cooperation and civil approaches to space to one whereby more and more officials from this administration, such as, for example, the new nominee for the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Christine Wormuth, in her nomination hearing, she spoke about the need for greater investments in counter-space capabilities and space protection for national security space systems. The new Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense, who will be covering both space policy and cyber policy in the DoD, Eric Rosenbach, spoke of the same things. For over a year now, people like General William Shelton, who is the commander of Air Force Space Command, and also General Robert Kaler, the recently departed commander of Strategic Command, have spoken at length about the threats to US space systems and the requirements needed to protect them. And more recently, General Kaler's replacement, Admiral Haney at Strategic Command, has testified to Congress to the same effect. So the policy, if you will, is fit for purpose. It's a very flexible policy. However, what we have seen is a shift in emphasis in that policy towards issues like space protection, space control, counterspace, an emphasis on things like, for example, what William Shelton has been talking about for the past 2 years, disaggregation of space systems. Instead of large $100 million satellites with various payloads on board, we have smaller platforms, and those payloads are put onto those various smaller platforms. So instead of one large target in orbit, there are many targets that complicate the plans of adversaries. That's a good plan. However, it's not necessarily going to be applicable to all functions that we do in space. So we need to also give more hard thought, if you will, to how we protect traditional space systems that cannot be disaggregated in the future. But all these notions, these new, what I call new operational concept for national security space, are gaining traction not just within the national security space community, but also in Congress and also amongst the wider national security establishment in this administration. And that's good news, and we see this reflected in the President's budget request of last week. So, for example, if you look at the line items for the space protection and defense system, for counterspace, for space control, for programs that would contribute towards disaggregation, all of them have seen actually significant funding requests that have increased significantly from the past few years. And this is good news, this is a good thing, and this is a budget that's being matched to rhetoric, not just by officials in their testimony to Congress and other speeches, but also in the QDR. For all the criticism that has been abounding for the past week, this is one of the few bright spots, I would argue, in this respect. There are still, though, big gaps between the rhetoric and the funding. I would argue, actually, that what funding we are getting, I hope it's not too late, too soon, too late, but there is a chance it might be. China has not abated in its investments in counter-space technologies that are designed to deny US space capabilities for the past 10 years. We have been asleep at the wheel in many cases, despite many people in the intelligence community and the national security space establishment warning about this. And officials are beginning to pick up on this. I would also say from a partisan point of view that it's very significant when you hear officials from a openly about things like space control, counter space, and things like that, guess what that means? It means it's serious. They actually believe that there is really a threat, and they're right. There is. This is not empty rhetoric. And I'm a great believer that when it comes to the unfortunate weaponization of space, which I believe may happen one day, it will happen under a Democratic administration. Just as only Nixon could have gone to China, only a Democratic president can weaponize space without garnering all the controversy that might be heaped upon him should it have been a Republican administration. So we're seeing a shift in the emphasis on US space policy. There is also a lot of opportunities for cooperation with our allies in the Asia-Pacific, which I'm not sure we're taking full advantage of at present, especially with our ally Japan. There is a lot of talk at the moment between the US and Japan at the government-to-government level. There's comprehensive dialogue underway that's trying to establish the boundaries of cooperation. But there are still some issues to be resolved. But first of all, we also need to manage our expectations on both sides of the Pacific. From a US perspective, with diminishing budgets and so on, space cooperation cannot compensate for cuts taking place here in the US. They must have their own strategic rationale in and of themselves, not as an opportunity to fund programs that may be of relevance to the United States, but not necessarily of relevance to the Japanese. So we need to find common areas of opportunity and strategic rationale. However, cooperative opportunities can help strengthen the alliance between the US and Japan, build trust between the two countries, further trust that is. It can send a unified message to adversaries as part of a wider deterrent strategy, and can contribute greatly to diplomacy, both between the two countries but also regionally. And some of the areas that we might want to consider serious cooperation, and by that I mean capability cooperation, include maritime domain awareness, which Representative Kawai eloquently spoke about, space situational awareness, with which we already have an agreement with Japan, but there's still much work to be done in terms of developing more sensitive and more capable sensors, and also providing more comprehensive data between the two countries. Satellite communications integration. Japan missed an opportunity recently when it purchased the X-band satellite through its Ministry of Defense, and because of the inverted polarization of its antennas, technical term, but the real nux of that is basically that the X-band satellite cannot communicate with US and Australian wideband satellites provided by their militaries. So in the next generation of Japanese satellite communications, there are opportunities for cooperation there. A common launcher. Epsilon and H3, in terms of their second stage especially, and engines, could provide an opportunity for cooperation. There could be cooperation in development of small satellites and their buses. And also, more importantly, beyond just capability, there also needs to be cooperation between the two countries and their intelligence communities in terms of common space threat assessments. Challenges to such cooperation include, and these are being resolved, but there are still issues, the Japanese interagency process, which, for any veteran of Washington, Tokyo makes Washington look like a positive kumbaya moment when it comes to interagency cooperation. Tokyo is working on these issues through the establishment of its National Security Council and so on, and I've seen it personally. We have seen departments in Tokyo work together on issues that hitherto haven't necessarily been the case. Here in Washington, we need to work better on things like US export controls that are actually getting in the way of geopolitical imperatives in the Asia-Pacific. For example, how can Japan cooperate with regional partners in the Asia-Pacific, partners like Thailand, Vietnam, and others, if they can't export satellites to those countries because certain widgets in those satellites are under ITAR control? And so we're privileging non-proliferation over establishing an actual region-wide security grouping that might help us in countering the rise of China. And then also we need to consider how the US directly cooperates with regional partners in the area beyond just Japan, but also with the Republic of Korea, with Vietnam, with Singapore, and so on. So there are plenty of work to be done here, but we have to also understand that these countries are starting from a position that we were only here 30 years ago. We have integrated to the point whereby these systems are woven into our operations. They can't just be withdrawn from our operations and expect things to carry on as before. And so patience is required from the US because these countries are starting from a fresh slate. They haven't integrated space to anywhere near the extent that we have. And they may not want to for their own particular political and cultural purposes, but also for their own doctrinal purposes. But there is still plenty of room and opportunity for cooperation there. And with that, I thank you.
Okay, we will now take time for question. Please wait for the mic to come to you and then identify yourself and affiliation. Go ahead.
Is this on? I'm Blevin Bowen, a visiting scholar with the Space Policy Institute. A question for Representative Kawai. In one of your slides, you had the term suspicious satellite. I was hoping you could elaborate a bit more on what a suspicious satellite could be and what Japan could do about it.
はい、これはスライドでもお見せしましたが、SSA スペースコーポレーションスペースシチュエーショナルアウェアネス SSA のその中に位置づけられております。まあどこの国が保有する衛星かということは言及を控えたいと思いますけれども、一般的に、日本のにとっての平和とそして安全保障に、重大な関わりがあるだろうと、そのような推測をするような衛星のことを今念頭に置いております。
As you saw in the slide, it's part of the SSA considerations. The suspicious satellite is a term that might trigger your interest, but I would like to refrain from naming the specific country, but it would be the satellite that would be potentially posing some risk to Japan's security.
Suspicious とはsuspicious ということです。
Suspicious is potentially suspicious to Japan's security.
Go ahead. Yeah, the front line is the mayor. Okay.
Yes, hello. For the panel, are there any plans for recovering debris or satellites that may be out of control? What types of functions or what types of systems are being planned or are there available now that might be able to capture or contain this type of concern?
Address to the
Well, aside from, once again, various science fiction movies, James Bond, if I remember right, had one entire movie dedicated to things capturing satellites. The reality is that capturing satellites is actually rather difficult. These things move at very high speed, and collision is omnipresent. In fact, we've had satellite collisions already that have generated even more debris between, for example, a Iridium satellite and a Russian Cosmos satellite. The problems are, first off, there's an awful lot of stuff up there. So we think of space as limitless, but especially in low Earth orbit, there's quite a lot of things ranging from, I believe, a couple of Hasselblad cameras that got off people's necks to screws, paint chips, all the way up to third stages of rockets. So part of this is, how do you go about deorbiting them? They don't come with engines and things, and it's not like you can just go and attach an engine to something and shoot it down. Second of all, who is going to pay for this? There was always the great hope that cost to orbit would drop precipitously, but it hasn't. So somebody is going to have to go up there, even if it's just robotically, because you don't want to risk people's lives necessarily, and you're going to have to buy engines or lasers or something to push these things either all the way out into deep space or all the way back into orbit. There's liability issues. If something comes down wrong, whose fault is that? Is it person who put an engine on it and miscalculated? Or is it the person who actually put the thing up in the first place? So all of this is to say that space junk, space debris, is sort of like the weather. Everybody complains about it and nobody does anything about it. And for about the same reasons, which is to say that physics is hard, and costs are hard to assign. And in the context of the commons, in the sense of common space, this is the tragedy of the commons, right? Where did that come from? Everybody put their cows in the public pasture. Nobody fertilized public pasture, and after a while you wind up with a dead pasture. Here we have the same sort of situation where space is accessible to all, but not everyone always pays attention to not generating debris. And in fact, as the representative noted, the Chinese ASAT test in 2007 was probably the single worst space debris generating event in all of history. And yet, what price has China had to pay for acting, frankly, irresponsibly? Not one canceled contract, not one permanently withdrawn ambassador, not one disinvitation. Instead, if I were the Chinese, I would say that apparently there is no cost to generating debris. This is a set of very badly mismatched incentives and consequences.
Thank you. Kevin Mayer from Innovate Consulting. Speaking of the ASAT test, what's your assessment of the vulnerability of U.S. satellites, or Japanese satellites for that matter, to the Chinese anti-satellite capability?
We actually have quite a few vulnerabilities to their counter-space programs, which includes a kinetic kill anti-satellite capability that was tested in 2007. The truth is the Chinese are developing a whole range of counter-space capabilities to include kinetic kill. And the majority of our satellites, both civil, commercial, and national security, are vulnerable to those capabilities to some extent or another. There has not been in recent years enough emphasis or investments in space protection programs here in the United States for our more sensitive satellites. And as far as I'm aware, there have been no investments in Japan on these issues. So a lot of our satellites are subject to jamming, spoofing, if they're communicating, for example, so GPS, communication satellites, sensitive remote sensing satellites, including classified ones allegedly, are sensitive to and vulnerable to dazzling by lasers and those kind of things. A lot of our satellites cannot maneuver in time against a kinetic threat, such as a direct-ascent missile launched from mainland China that would target them. And it wouldn't take much to bring down a lot of US space superiority in this regard, or indeed Allied superiority. You don't have to take down the entire GPS constellation in order to make GPS less than effective for most national security purposes, such as, for example, using precision-guided munitions. So we're very vulnerable in quite a few areas. Part of the problem we have is, one, lack of resources for funding space protection programs that might mitigate a lot of these vulnerabilities, but also a sense of, if you will, mirror imaging and disbelief among many policymakers, not just the US, but in the West in general, which is, well, China is becoming just as reliant on space systems as we are. Surely that would somehow self-deter them from engaging in these very damaging activities. And yet the evidence I'm seeing from the PLA and so on is that they don't seem to be self-deterred at all. The evidence I'm seeing is that they're calculating they may be able to live with that kind of damage, and that they can live without access to these kind of systems. And I think there's some truth to that. So we're very vulnerable. We're starting to do something about it at last after several years of not doing anything about it. But as I said in my remarks, I fear it may be too little too late at this stage, because China has a 10-year head start on us in this regard.
If I could follow up very
Yes,
quickly
please.
on that, two additional points. One is that the Chinese think about space not simply in terms of what is in orbit, but as a holistic system, the terrestrial stations and the data links. So when we talk about when they talk about space vulnerabilities, it is not simply the array of various anti-satellite capabilities that they are developing, but also the ability to target and destroy or interfere with terrestrial stations, launch facilities, tracking, telemetry, and control sites, and also the ability to engage in cyber activities against the data links, both those that control the satellites, but also the data coming off the satellites, which are in fact two separate types of information. The other point that I would also note is, and John touched on this, which is this mirror imaging. You hear from a lot of people this idea that, of course, China will wind up being equally vulnerable because they will inevitably wind up recreating a space architecture much like ours. And I always find this fascinating because so far China's space program actually doesn't look very much like either the American or the Soviet or the current Russian space programs. Why it is that people, I mean, do they think that somehow they can wave a magic wand and China will wind up looking like us? The reality is that the Chinese have identified vulnerabilities. To assume that they will build the same architecture is to assume that they will just walk into recreating vulnerabilities, when in fact there is a great deal of evidence that the Chinese have tried to avoid creating comparable vulnerabilities. So, and that creates its own set of interesting asymmetries. That means that one could in fact not only live with potentially a degraded space environment, but may ultimately be less vulnerable because while it's too late for us to become less integrated, less woven in, China is still early enough along in the process that it can make resource allocation choices that will not put it in the same situation 10 or 15 years down the road.
Okay.
It's Hermes from Occupy Wall Street. I just wanted to see you elaborate a little bit about the future. What form do you think will take the confrontation this next 10 to 20 years? What form?
What form?
Yeah.
Yeah, what form the confrontation will take place?
Well, I'll take a shot at that, I guess. In terms of the confrontation, Stephen Colbert, basically noted space analyst, was quite correct when he described the U.S.-Chinese relationship as that of frenemy. The U.S. and China are each other's largest economic trading partners, but that is not to say that we share the same perspectives. We have significant points of difference in terms of interests, not least of which is that China and many of its neighbors have outstanding territorial problems. And while that is not a direct issue for the United States, many of those countries are U.S. allies. And as we have heard many, many times, for example, on the issue of the Senkakus, that while the U.S. takes no position about the territorial sovereignty of the Senkakus, because they are under the administrative control of Japan, therefore the U.S.-Japan mutual security relationship applies to the Senkakus. So right there you have an example of how, in theory, you could have a situation that ultimately becomes a much more active, kinetic confrontation. That being said, what shape is it likely to take? I think that in all of the relevant capitals, Beijing, Tokyo, Washington, and elsewhere in the region, Bangkok, Manila, there is a desire to avoid military confrontation. I don't think anyone wants conflict. This is not 1914. China is not the Kaiser. He is not hankering for a war to establish China's place in the sun. But unfortunately, as in this, the 100th anniversary of World War I, what countries want and what they wind up with are not always the same. Whether it is due to miscalculation, whether it is due to bravado, whether it is due to domestic concerns that eclipse concerns for stability. So what shape will it take? Very hard to predict. And that in and of itself probably should be a cause of worry.
I agree with Dean. I mean, one of the forms that potential conflict may take, and of course we should all hope it doesn't happen that way, but again, what we wish for and what happens are two different things, is that among these territorial disputes between China and other countries in the region, not just with Japan, but also countries like Philippines, Vietnam, and so on, is that when, for example, Chinese vessels crowd the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea or the Senkakus in the East China Sea, and so on, there are usually corresponding cyber attacks against these targets in these countries. And we may see in the future more concentrated, for example, jamming of commercial satellite systems to go along with that to cut off communications, create disorientation, all of which are in the gray zone, if you will, between war and peace in terms of military conflict and regular diplomatic exchanges, if you will. The problem with those kind of activities is that they can lead to miscalculation and misperception, which then leads to something where we all just don't want to be. And so, these kind of activities we're going to see a lot more of, unfortunately, and therefore it increases that fog between war and peace, and that's a worry, that's a vulnerability.
先ほどから尖閣諸島の名前が出ましたので、少しそのことについてお答えをさせていただきますが、お互いに予測しない、そしてお互いに、欲していないけれども偶発的な、尖閣諸島をめぐって日中間の軍事衝突というものについて、ずっとワシントンのいろんな友人たちと会って、心底から心配をしてくれているというふうに私は感じております。
Since Senkaku was mentioned, I'd like to say a word about this. It is unpredictable. The unpredictability is the key here. The unexpected event may trigger military confrontation between the two countries, I mean China and Japan. And I am hearing from my friends in Washington a great deal of concern about such unintended, unexpected explosion of military
そ
power.
れで先ほどお二人の方がお互いの計算違いとか誤った認識からさまざまな衝突が起きることの懸念をおっしゃいましたけれども、例えば今日お話をした MDA によって、基本的に私中国の最大の問題点というのはその実際の軍事政策が極めて不透明であると。外から何が起こって何の意図に基づいてやろうとしているのか周辺の国々にとっては、はっきりと認識することができない点にあると思いますね。そこでこの宇宙空間のさまざまな資源を宇宙技術を活用することによって、日本だけじゃなくてアメリカをはじめとする同盟国友好国と一緒になって中国の意図というものを具体的な情報で、確実に抑えるということは私アジア太平洋地域にとっての平和と安全につながっていくだろうとそう考えています。
Two other gentlemen mentioned the possibility or probability of a conflict evolving from unexpected incidents. So I mentioned MDA as a means of preparing for incidents. The problem of China's movement is the non-transparent nature of their intentions. And from the fact, if we know the reality through systems like MDA, we'll be able to assess the intentions. Although it may not be clarified, we'll be able to assess the direction that things are moving. And in that sense, cooperation among the allied nations is quite important, I think.
Thank you. I'm Fan Gang from Chinese Academy of Sciences, Institute of Policy Management. Now I'm a visiting scholar at JW. I have a question to Mr. Dean Chen. You have made a very interesting point that China holds a overall power perspective, and you also concluded that if I'm not with that a overall competition between China and Japan, maybe US. So my question is just opposite to the previous one is. Do you see any chance or opportunities between China and US or Japan to cooperate? And in what kind of forms? Or if not, why? Thank you.
Well, since this is a forum about space, I'll try to limit my suggestions to space-related issues. But I will note that, again, for two countries that have such large economic interests, there is cooperation. It happens every minute of every day. It's called trade. So all those container ships, all those financial transactions, that is a form of cooperation because these relations occur voluntarily. But in the context of space, is there room for cooperation? There is. It requires a lot of political effort on both sides. It requires, unfortunately, a lot of structural change, not least of which, unfortunately, a lot of it is going to have to come from China. Because the reality is that on the American side, space policy is relatively transparent. John mentioned, for example, the national space policy. There's also been national security space strategy. These are public documents. They are put out irregularly, but they do come out regularly. China produces a space white paper every 5 years. More importantly is that we, frankly, do not have a very good sense of how China's space program is managed. And that is not for lack of trying. For example, China's space program has a very large role for the People's Liberation Army, which in and of itself is going to limit the opportunity for cooperation. But how much does China spend on space? This is a very straight, we at least get an official figure from China on its defense budget. The National People's Congress just announced, translates to about $138 billion. What is China's space budget? The number we use is dated from 1998. China today is a little different from it was in 1998. And yet the only number we have is China spends $2 billion on space in 1998. This is nonsense. I'm sorry, but that's the only word I can come up for that. Without the ability to know who is in charge of China's space program, without the ability to know how China's space program is managed, how in the world do you cooperate with someone? This would be like walking into a dark room where I have no idea who's there. I can hear some voices, and someone says, yes, well, I think we should cooperate. I think we should cooperate in your security. I think we should cooperate on your livelihood. Trust me. I don't think that the Chinese would trust people who said that, and they would be right. How in the world, then, are we to have cooperation? Things are not then helped when you wind up with people making rather silly statements like, I'll leave aside the silly statements. The Chinese are creating a new national security council. It would be very interesting to know whether space is part of that. It would be very interesting to know whether or not that National Security Council, if it is responsible for space, would be willing to talk to neighboring countries, be willing to talk to somewhat more distant countries, be willing to talk to third-party countries on space issues at a level of responsibility. So in other words, not just the head of CNSA, because he happens to be the head of CNSA, and by the way, that's third after being vice minister of MIIT and deputy director at SASTIN, but somebody who perhaps is a e.g. first-tier bureaucrat who is actually in charge of space. If they were to engage Japan, the United States, and European from northern Alabama, space officials.
One thing that comes to my mind, and is perhaps a mischievous thought, is that there might be certain maritime domain awareness programs that we would perhaps, space-based maritime domain awareness programs, that is, that one might invite China into, especially, for example, providing a measure of transparency to activities of all actors in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. You're perhaps better placed than I am to comment on whether China would find such a proposal acceptable. That's just a thought I just plucked out of the air there.
But 今の、ご質問を聞きながら僕は100の言葉よりも一つの行動で、人は別の人を判断するということを考えました。
As an analogy, listening to you, I thought of this as one action would be better than 100 words. We often say that. And
先ほど、宇宙ゴミの、デブリの質問もありましたけれども、やはりその中国が本当に宇宙空間で どのように振る舞ってこれまで来たのかということを特に近隣のに住んでいる私たちとすれば、注意深くしっかりと見てきています。
For example, regarding the space debris, we have been closely observing how China has been behaving regarding the debris, the increase of this space debris.
僕はお金のかかるこの宇宙開発というのは本来は一つの国だけで、賄うことができません。国際的な協調の枠組みで作っていくということは大変賛成でありますけれども、やはりその前提として共通の価値観というものを共有できる仲間と国際協調で宇宙開発はこれからも進めていくべきであって、宇宙のゴミを発生することについてやっぱり国際法の仕組みをしっかりとみんなで作っていく必要があると私はそのように考えています。
Space activities cost money, and it is not possible for one country to bear the entire cost. And of course, the cooperation is necessary. And yet, for the purpose of effective cooperation, first we have to share the common values. And just for controlling the space debris alone, we have to share this common basis, and international law and international code of conduct would be an absolute necessity.
It might be last question. Okay, I have one question to Ms. Representative Kawai. I think the U.S. has already had many people to work space area in national security, but this is just new for Japan. How will Japan train to people to work this area, space area in national security?
極めて鋭いご指摘をいただきました。
It's a very pointed and a good question.
先ほど言いましたように西暦2006年に私が宇宙基本法の草案を作った時と今とまた日本を取り巻いている安全保障の環境外交の環境は大きく変わってきています。
The environment surrounding Japan, the diplomatic and strategic environment surrounding Japan is changing rapidly since the days of the draft was prepared in 2006.
その時点では日本の宇宙政策の司令塔を新しく作るということを基本法にも明記をしましたけれども、率直に言ってその後さまざまな省庁間の確執などもあり、私は今の日本の宇宙政策の司令塔は十分に期待に応えるだけ機能していないとそのように評価しています。
At the time of the drafting the law, the idea was to establish one central focal controlling and guiding body. However, due to the ministerial and organizational strifes, the situation is not developed into that ideal situation.
それとつい最近ですけど安倍総理大臣の強力な指導性によりまして国家安全保障局が日本にも設置をされました。この国家安全保障局の中でもこれからの宇宙政策というものは考えていかなきゃいけないと私は思います。
Under Prime Minister Abe's strong leadership, the National Security Secretariat was created, and this might serve as one focal point for such a leading role.
でしかしながらまだ日本版の NSC はできたばかりで宇宙政策について、しっかりとした責任の所在がはっきりとしていません。
Nevertheless, this Japanese version of NSC is still in the infancy, and the structure for coordinated control and guidance of the space-related policy is not strong.
で先ほど言いました2016年か17年には、ISEF の2回目の総会が、日本で開かれますけれども、もう今本当に最悪だと思っているのはその時に主催する日本の閣僚が 外務大臣、それから文部科学大臣、宇宙担当大臣、経産大臣、それから、おそらく NSC を所管するのは、官房長官ですから、5人の日本の閣僚がずらっとこうやって一人の議長役やるなんてことは、私にとっても悪夢以外の何物でもありません。
As mentioned earlier, in 2016 or 17, the second meeting of ISEF would be held. However, imagining that five ministers, foreign ministry, the cultural ministry, the economics, and the space agency, and the cabinet secretary taking lead in the trying to play the role of chairman of the meeting at the same time would be just an unimaginable situation.
ですから、できるだけ早く政治が主導する形で、真の意味での日本の宇宙政策の司令塔を作っていく。そして、横江さんがおっしゃったようなしっかりとした新しい日本の宇宙政策の基本をもう一度作り直していかなきゃいけない。そう考えます。
So I strongly believe that the political requirement is to establish a control tower, so to speak, for Japan's space policy and space activities first.
Yeah, we need to collaborate in this area too. Okay, I think time is coming, and then today is Representative Kawai's birthday. This is from Heritage Foundation.
Thank you very much. I almost forget it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for speakers and all people for coming. Have a great day.